On the 22nd day of April, our party set sail in a large schooner from Fort George, or Niagara town, and in 2 days crossed Lake Ontario to Kingston, at the head of the River St. Lawrence, distant from Niagara about 200 miles. Here we hired an American barge, a large flat-bottomed boat, to carry us to Montreal, the further distance of 200 miles, then set out for Kingston on the 28th of April, and arrived the same evening at Ogdensburg, at a distance of 75 miles. The following evening we arrived at Cornwall, and the succeeding night at Pointe du Lac, on Lake St. Francis. Here the bargemen obtained our permission to return up the river, and we embarked in another barge, deeply laden with pot, ashes, passengers, and luggage. Above Montreal, for nearly 100 miles, the River St. Lawrence is interrupted in its course by rapids, which are occasioned by the river being confined in comparatively narrow, shallow, rocky channels. Through these it rushes with great force and noise, and is agitated like the ocean in a storm. Many people prefer these rapids, for grandeur of appearance, to the Falls of Niagara. They are from half a mile to 9 miles long each, and require regular pilots. On the 30th of April we arrived at the village of Cedars, immediately below which are 3 sets of very dangerous rapids, the Cedars, the Split Rock, and the Cascades, distant from each other about 1 mile. On the morning of the 1st of May, we set out from the Cedars, the barge very deep and very leaky. The captain, a daring, rash man, refused to take a pilot. After he had passed the Cedars rapid, not without danger, the captain called for some rum, swearing at the same time, that God Almighty could not steer the barge better than he did. Soon after this we entered the Split Rock Rapids, by a wrong channel, and found ourselves advancing rapidly towards a dreadful watery precipice, down which we went. The barge slightly grazed her bottom against the rock, and the fall was so great as to nearly take away the breath. We here took in a great deal of water, which was mostly bailed out again before we hurried on to what the Canadians call the Grand Bouillon, or Great Boiling. In approaching this place the captain let go the helm, saying, "By God, here we fill." The barge was almost immediately overwhelmed in the midst of immense foaming breakers, which rushed over the bows, carrying a blade planks, always, etc. About half a minute elapsed between the filling and going down of the barge, during which I had sufficient presence of mind to strip off my 3 coats, and was loosening my suspenders when the barge sunk, and I found myself floating in the midst of people, baggage, etc. Each man caught hold of something. One of the crew caught hold of me, and kept me down under water, but contrary to my expectation, let me go again. On rising to the surface, I got hold of a trunk, on which 2 other men were then holding. Just at this spot, where the Split Rock Rapids terminate, the bank of the river is well inhabited, and we could see the women on shore, running about much agitated. They can do put off, and picked up 3 of our number, who had gained the bottom of the barge, which had upset and got rid of its cargo. These they landed on an island. The canoe put off again, and was approaching near to where I was holding on to the trunk, when, terrified of the vicinity of the Cascades, to which we were approaching, it put back, notwithstanding my exhortations, in French and English, to induce the 2 men on board to advance. About hold which one man had of the trunk to which we were adhering, subjected him to constant emotion, and, in order to escape his seizing hold of me, I let go of the trunk, and in conjunction with another man, had got hold of the boom, which, with the gaff, sails, etc. had been detached from the mast to make room for the cargo, and floated off. I had just time to grasp this boom, when we were hurried into the Cascades. In these I was instantly buried, and nearly suffocated. On rising to the surface, I found one of my hands still on the boom and my companion still adhering to the gaff. Shortly after descending the Cascades, I perceived the barge, bottom upwards, floating near me. I succeeded in getting to it, and held by a crack in one end of it. The violence of the water, and the falling out of the casks of ashes, has quite wrecked it. For a long time on I contented myself with this hold, not daring to endeavour to get upon the bottom, which I had length effected, and from this my new situation, I called out to my companion, who still preserved his hold of the gaff. He shook his head, and when the waves suffered me to look up again, he was gone. He made no attempt to come near me, being unable or unwilling to let go his hold and trust himself to the waves, which were then rolling over his head. The cascades of a kind of fall, or rapid descent, in the river, over a rocky channel below, going down is called by the French sauter, to leap or shove the cascades. For 2 miles below, the channel continues in uproar just like a storm at sea, and I was frequently nearly washed off the barge by the waves which rolled over. I now entertained no hope whatever of escaping, and although I continued to exert myself to hold on, such was the state to which I was reduced by cold, that I wished only for a speedy death, and frequently thought of giving up the contest as useless. I felt as if compressed into the size of a monkey, my hands appeared diminished in size 1/2, and I certainly should, after I became very cold and much exhausted, have fallen asleep, but for the waves which were passing over me, and obliged me to attend to my situation. I had never descended the St. Lawrence before, but I knew there were more rapids ahead, perhaps another set of the Cascades, but at all events, the Lachine Rapids, whose situation I did not exactly know. I was in hourly expectation of these putting an end to me, and often fancied some points of ice, extending from the shore, to be the head of foaming rapids. At one of the moments in which the succession of waves permitted me to look up, I saw at a distance a canoe with 4 men, coming towards me, and waited in confidence to hear the sound of their paddles, but in this I was disappointed. The men, as I afterwards learned, were Indians, genuine descendants of the Tatars, who, happening to fall in with one of the passengers' trunks, picked it up, and returned to shore, for the purpose of pillaging it, leaving, as they afterwards acknowledged, the man on the boat to his fate. Indeed, I am certain I should have had more to fear from the avarice, than to hope from their humanity, and it is more than probable, that my life would have been taken, to secure them in possession of my watch and several half-eagles which I had about me. The accident happened at about 8 o'clock in the morning. In the course of some hours, as the day advanced, the sun grew warmer, and the wind blew from the south, and the water became calmer. I got upon my knees, and found myself in the small lake St. Louis, but 3 to 5 miles wide. With some difficulty I got up on my feet, but was soon convinced, by cramps and spasms in my sinews, that I was quite incapable of swimming any distance, and I was then 2 miles from shore. I was now going, with wind and current, to destruction, and cold, hungry, and fatigued, was obliged again to sit down in the water to rest, when an extraordinary circumstance greatly relieved me. On examining the wreck, to see if it was possible to detach any part of it to steer by, I perceived something loose, entangled in a fork of the wreck, and so carried along. This I found to be a small trunk, bottom upwards, which, with some difficulty, I dragged up upon the barge. After nearly an hour's work, in which I broke my penknife trying to cut out the lock, I made a hole in the top, and, to my great astonishment, drew out a bottle of rum, a cold tongue, some cheese, and a bag full of bread, cakes, etc., all wet. Of these I made a seasonable though very moderate use, and the trunk answered the purpose of a chair to sit upon, elevated above the surface of the water. After in vain endeavoring to steer the wreck, or direct its course to the shore, and having made every signal with my waistcoat, etc. in my power, to the several headlands which I have passed, I fancied I was driving into a bay, which, however, soon proved to be the termination of the lake, and the opening of the river, the current of which was carrying me rapidly along. I passed several uninhabited islands, but the banks of the river appearing to be covered with houses, I again renewed my signals with my waistcoat, and a shirt which I took out of the trunk, hoping, as the river narrowed, they might be perceived. The distance was too great. The velocity with which I was going, convinced me of my near approach to the dreadful rapids of Lachine. Night was drawing on, my destruction appeared certain, but did not disturb me very much. The idea of death had lost its novelty, and become very familiar. Finding signals in vain, I now set up a cry or howl, such as I thought best calculated to carry to a distance, and being favoured with the wind, it did, although at above a mile distance, reach the ears of some people on shore. At last I perceived my boat rowing towards me, which, being very small and white-bottomed, I had for some time taken for a fowl with a white breast, and I was taken off the barge by Captain Johnston, after being 10 hours on the water. I found myself at the village of Lachine, 21 miles below where the accident happened, and having been driven by the winding of the current a much greater distance. I received no other injury and bruised knees and breast, with a slight cold. The accident took some hold of my imagination, and for 7 or 8 succeeding nights, in my dreams, I was engaged in the dangers of the Cascades, and surrounded by drowning men. My escape was owing to a concurrence of fortunate circumstances, which appear almost providential. I happened to catch hold of various articles of support, and to exchange each article for another, just at the right time. Nothing but the boom could have carried me down the Cascades without injury, and nothing but the barge could have saved me below them. I was also fortunate in having the whole day. Had the accident happened 1 hour later, I should have arrived opposite the village of Lachine after dark, and of course should have been destroyed in the rapids below, to which I was swiftly advancing. The trunk, which furnished me with provisions and a resting place above the water, I have every reason to think was necessary to save my life. Without it, I must have passed the whole time in the water, and been exhausted with cold and hunger. When the people on shore saw our boat take the wrong channel, they predicted our destruction. The floating baggage, by supporting us for a time, enabled them to make an exertion to save us, but as it was not supposed possible to survive the passage of the Cascades, no further exertions were thought of, nor, indeed, could they well have been made. It was at this very place the General Ambert's brigade of 300 men, coming to attack Canada, were lost. The French at Montreal received the first intelligence of the invasion, by the dead bodies floating past the town. The pilot who conducted the first bateau, committing the same error as we did, ran for the wrong channel, and the other bateau following close, all were involved in the same destruction. The whole party, with which I was, escaped, for left the barge at the Cedars village, above the rapids, and went to Montreal by land. 2 more were saved by the canoe. The barge's crew, all accustomed to labor, were lost. Of the 8 men who passed down the Cascades, none but myself escaped or were seen again, nor, indeed, was it possible for any one, without my extraordinary luck, and the aid of the barge, to which they must have been very close, to have escaped. The other men must have drowned immediately on entering the Cascades. The trunks, etc. to which they adhered, and the heavy greatcoats which they had on, very probably helped to overwhelm them, but they must have gone at all events. Swimming in such a current of broken stormy waves was impossible. Still, I think, my knowing how to swim kept me more collected, and renders me more willing to part with one article of support to gain a better. Those who could not swim, naturally clung to whatever hold they first got, and of course many had very bad ones. The captain passed me above the Cascades, when the sack of wool and cloths, which were doubtless soon saturated and sunk. The trunk which I picked up belonged to a young man from Upper Canada, who was one of those drowned. It contained clothes, and about 70 shillings in gold, which were restored to his friends. My own trunk contained, besides clothes, about 200 shillings in gold and banknotes. On my arrival at Lachine, I offered a reward of $100 which induced a Canadian to go in search of it. He found it, some days after, on the shore of an island on which it had been driven, and brought it to Lachine, where I happened to be at the time. I paid him his reward, and understood that about 1/3 of it was to be immediately applied to the purchase of a certain number of masses, which he had failed, in the events of success, previous to his setting out on the search.